Hi and welcome to the Bible Standard, and in this exciting video we're looking at Paul's three great mysteries. Now those mysteries are: was Paul a member of the Sanhedrin and therefore married? We locate that in Acts chapter 26 verse 10. Secondly, what was the third heaven that Paul referenced? To 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 2. And thirdly, what was the thorn in the flesh that Paul requested to be removed? 2 Corinthians 12 verse 11. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and drop us a comment in the comment section. Let us know if you agree with the presenter's findings.
Well, hi and welcome to Christadelphian videos. Today we will be looking at the Apostle Paul and three mysteries which involve the Apostle. So let's go to the second letter to the Corinthians, and we're going to look at chapter 12 and verses 2 and 3, because in those verses there is a really important principle for us. So I'm going to read those verses. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 2 and 3. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago. Whether in the body, I cannot tell, or whether out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth. Such an one caught up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth. So, in these two verses, we find this important principle applied three times. And we can be sure that when the inspired word repeats something three times, that it's something that is important. And I wonder if you've spotted it. Now, just in case you haven't, I'm just going to move to the next slide. And I think it should be obvious to you looking at this slide. Human nature likes certainty. In fact, if we went back to 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 8, we read there, verse 8, for if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself for the battle? If we hear someone speaking on a subject and he sounds rather uncertain, we will tend to think that he hasn't prepared, he hasn't done his research. Now, in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul shows to us that there is no shame in saying, I don't know. He says it three times in two verses. And so we need to be willing to accept that there are things that we will not know before the return of Christ. Now, a few years ago, I wrote a brotherly email to a prominent speaking brother over a point where he had predicted a certain future event. And I was pleasantly surprised at his response. He was genuinely surprised that what he had said was being repeated even in public talks as exactly how future events would unfold. He explained that it was only his opinion, which could well be wrong. He didn't know whether he was right or wrong, and had assumed that others understood that this was just his opinion and not something to be taken as absolutely certain. Now, of course, we must not be uncertain about the first principles of the truth. However, the three mysteries that we are to look at tonight are going to be uncertain. We can, of course, look at the evidence and may eliminate some possibilities. We may also form an opinion on the most probable solution. We need, though, to understand that probability is not the same as certainty. Our first mystery is the question as to whether or not the Apostle Paul had been a member of the Sanhedrin, and therefore, as it was also a requirement to be married to be a member of the Sanhedrin, as to whether or not he was married. So here we have our mystery number one. In Acts 26 and verse 10, we read, as we have on the slide there, the part of the verse which is used as evidence that Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, and also therefore that he was married. Now, here's what we have there in the verse. And when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them. And that is from the authorised King James Version. Now, modern versions tend to say, rather than I gave my voice against them, I voted against them. The implication being that Paul gave his vote to put followers of Jesus to death in the voting system of the Sanhedrin. Now, there is a problem here, and in John 18 verse 31 we can see the problem. You see, the Romans did not allow the Jewish courts to condemn someone to death. So let's go there. That's John chapter 18 verse 31. Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him and judge him according to your law. And the Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. You may, of course, go to the stoning of Stephen as evidence, but this was a mob riot, not an orderly vote of the Sanhedrin. So we may ask, why is it in Acts 26 verse 10 that Paul says, And when they were put to death, I gave my voice or my vote against them? Well, the voting system of the Sanhedrin involved the members throwing a stone down into an urn, and it's thought that they used a black stone for guilty and a white stone for innocent. When we look at the Greek text of Acts 26 verse 10, it doesn't mention a vote, but rather it just says that he threw down his stone or his pebble, and that's all it says. The translators have then treated the Greek as idiomatic rather than literal. Now, before we go to the next slide to illustrate this, let's make sure that we understand what we mean by idiom. If I say that somebody has let the cat out of the bag, we understand that he has given away a secret. There is no literal cat and there is no literal bag. It is what we call an idiom. But we can generally work out if a phrase is meant to be taken literally or as an idiom from the context. So let's just go to the next slide. Now at the top, you can see how I gave my voice against. It is actually two Greek words. Now the box on the lower left shows how G2702, which is the Strong's reference to the Greek word, that word is a verb and it has the meaning to throw or to cast down. Now on the right, we see that the next Greek word with the reference G5585 means a stone and is derived from a root meaning to handle. Hence the meaning here, a handleable stone. So it's not a stone that's too big to handle, nothing too small. It's a stone that you can hold in your hand. And in fact in Revelation chapter 2 verse 17, where it talks of names being written on a white stone, that is that same word for a stone there. It's a stone that you can hold in your hand. So in Acts 26 verse 10, Paul is actually saying, And when they were put to death, I cast down my stone. So in the literal form, it doesn't talk of votes, it doesn't talk of voice, it says, I cast down my stone when they were put to death. Well, translators, of course, here are faced with a dilemma. Is the phrase literal or idiom? In this case, they've treated the phrase as idiomatic rather than literal. the word voting being used, or voice, rather than throwing a stone downwards at the person. And it may seem to be nonsense to suggest that Paul could be referring to his part in a stoning, possibly Paul being the first person to throw a stone. You see, why wouldn't the stone be thrown at the victim rather than being thrown downwards? The idea of throwing the stone downwards doesn't fit the picture that we may have seen in Bible storybooks. Why throw a stone downwards if you're stoning somebody? So we need to ask, is our picture right? Now, my next step on this was to do some research into stoning, and I found that stoning has an extensive history in a range of cultures. Typically, a person who was to be stoned would be either tied, hands and feet, or injuries would be inflicted so that they couldn't run away, or they would be thrown into a pit or off the edge of a cliff, so that again they would be injured before the actual stoning. And of course there were pits in Israel and wells. We can think of examples such as Joseph being thrown into a pit, so was Jeremiah, and even the law addressed responsibility if a person's ox or ass fell into someone's pit. In today's Iran, I understand that a small pit is dug and a man is buried up to his waist before stoning. Knowing this may help us to understand the traumatised state of some of our Iranian brethren who may have experienced such a stoning. In each case, we can picture the person throwing the first stone as walking up to the incapacitated victim on the ground in front of the mob and throwing the first stone and throwing it down at the victim. So this would fit Acts 26 verse 10 as a literal reading, and when they were put to death, I threw down my stone. So we're going to go to the next slide. Now, on the left, there is the best attempt of what I could achieve using Microsoft Copilot to generate a picture of how the stoning of Stephen could have been. Thrown into a well and then having stones thrown down at him. And we read in Acts 7 verse 60 that Stephen kneeled down and cried with a loud voice, "Lord, lay not this sin to their charge." The fact that he kneeled down tells us that he had his legs free, which would be quite unusual if he wasn't in a pit or something like that, because there would be the risk of the person who is being stoned running away, which would be the natural instinct. So it's quite possible that he was thrown into a pit for the stoning and then stoned. Of course, throwing the person into a pit would also ensure that the victim could not achieve much by trying to return the stones. Now, the picture at the bottom right is from the stoning of a woman in Afghanistan by the Taliban. Here you can see that she is in a hollow in the ground. Within that pit that she's in, she's partly buried so that she can't get out. So she's effectively trapped there. And you can see that the stones are thrown downwards at her. On the top middle, you can see why you would not have the storybook picture of Stephen with his back to a wall. I vaguely can remember a news article of a similar event where a boy threw a stone at a toughened glass window. The stone bounced, giving him a severe head injury. So you're not going to line the person up against a wall. On the top right, you can see also that standing in a circle, complete circle around the victim, would not be a good idea, because to kill somebody, the stones would be thrown very hard. So Acts 26 verse 10 would be consistent with events where Saul of Tarsus, a man with authority, consented to a stoning, presumably by going to where the person was, throwing down the first stone at them, and then retiring to leave everybody else to complete the job. So this is just a suggestion of an alternative understanding of Acts 26 verse 10, which perhaps leaves us with an open question here. The question of whether or not Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, and therefore also the question of whether or not he was married, which he would have to be if he was a member. So I will say with this that we've really got to say we can't be sure about that, but we don't know. Let's go to the next slide for our second mystery. Well, our next mystery here is about the third heaven. So let's just read from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 to 5, verse 1. It is not expedient for me, doubtless, to glory. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago. Whether in the body, I cannot tell, or whether out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth. Such an one caught up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth. How that he was caught up into paradise, and heard unspeakable words, which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such an one will I glory, yet of myself will I not glory, but in mine infirmities. So it's generally understood that the man who Paul is referring to actually is himself. So we're not going to look into that. But the question is, what is the third heaven? Well, I remember first coming across an explanation about 45 years ago on a campaign when it was suggested by a Welsh-speaking brother in the discussion, and it made sense. And so I'm going to present essentially that idea. Now, I have since heard some much more complicated solutions, but I prefer this solution that I'm about to present because of its simplicity. And it's often, we find in life, that the simple explanation is the one that is true. Of course, when we look at a new heaven, new earth, as we're going to, it's generally accepted that there is no literal destruction of the physical heavens and earth, but rather of man's works and systems. The heavens being used idiomatically for the ruling classes, and the earth for those who are subject to them and the systems that are established on the earth. In fact, we can show that at the return of Christ, which is one of these steps we're going to look at, that there is no literal total destruction of the earth by looking at verses such as Zechariah 14 verse 16 and also Isaiah 65 verses 22 to 24. And we can use those as evidence to show us there is not a literal destruction of heaven and earth at the return of Jesus. So I'm just going to quote here from Zechariah 14 verse 16 as a piece of evidence. Verse 16, and it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So we see that in the great destruction which is spoken of in Zechariah 14, that there are those who are left of the nations. Here we see that there will be survivors of the events at the return of Jesus to establish the kingdom. So please turn now to the second letter of Peter, chapter 3, and we're going to initially look at verses 5, 6 and 7. So this is the second letter of Peter, chapter 3 and verse 5. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens and earth, which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. So if we go back over these verses, in verse 5 we have the heavens that were of old and the earth. Now this looks like the first heavens and earth. They're the first ones referred to here. And then in verse 6, the next event in the series we have is the flood, and the world, which is that Greek word cosmos, meaning the orderly arrangement that perished. So here we have the pre-flood works of man and his systems of rulership, his false worship, everything of this being physically destroyed, only Noah and his family coming through that. And then in verse 7 we have the heavens and earth which are now. And perhaps the significance of verse 7 is really important here, saying that they're the heavens and earth which are now, which would imply and indicate that the present heavens and earth are not the same as those described in verse 5 as the heavens and earth of old. Or in other words, the second heavens and earth run from the flood up to the time that Peter was writing his letter, and therefore beyond that time as well. Now verse 7, if we go back to verse 7, also mentions the idea of a future destruction by fire. And this is expanded on in verses 12 and 13. Verse 12. Looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of the Lord, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. So putting that together with verse 7, we can see there that there's this destruction by fire leading to this new heavens and earth wherein righteousness dwells. So it sounds like this is the establishment of the kingdom, or the millennial age, which I suggest is the third heavens and earth. Now if we go back to verse 10, we see language there which is typically what we would associate with the return of Jesus as a thief in the night. So in 2 Peter 3 verse 10, but as the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, the earth also, and the works that are therein shall be burned up. There are 2 points to make here. Firstly, that the destruction is going to come in an unexpected moment, especially unexpected for those who are not awake and alert. Secondly, that phrase "as a thief" clearly does not indicate any sort of invisible, unnoticed coming. It is an event which involves massive worldwide destruction, in a similar way to that of the flood, but the description here is that of being destruction by fire. So I'm now going to go to the next slide for our summary. So, summarising 2 Peter 3, we have a first heavens and earth before the flood, then up to our present time we have the second heavens and earth, and then on with the return of Jesus, a new heavens and earth, making that the third. Thus I suggest that when Paul refers to experiencing the third heaven in 2 Corinthians 12, that this was an experience of being in the millennial age. Remember, Paul also in those verses referred to it as paradise, which has the idea of that beautiful garden, something on earth there. Eden restored, we might call it, on earth. And being the heavens, third heavens he talks of, we would take as being with the ruling powers of the millennial age, the immortalized saints. So whether he was physically projected into that time, or whether it was a vision, I know not. And clearly from what Paul says, he didn't know either, when we go back to 2 Corinthians 12. Well, before moving on to our next mystery, it's worth a visit to Revelation 21 and verse 1, because here we read, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away." So this might seem a little bit of a puzzle. You see, if the millennial age is the third heaven and earth, how is it that in Revelation 21 we have what appears to now be the post-millennial age in Revelation 21 and 22 being referred to as a second heaven and earth, the first having been passed away? And I suggest that a way of thinking about it here is that we have, as we discussed in 2 Peter 3, the first heaven and earth, the second heaven and earth, and the third heaven and earth. And then when we come to Revelation 21, these three are effectively clustered into one period of the era of sin and death. And then we have this referred to now as the second heaven and earth, being that post-millennial age, which is post-sin, post-death, and something's just so dramatically different from everything that's gone before. We now have God on earth with man. So a way of perhaps thinking about this, the way that I think of it is being somebody who's been involved a lot with software, is the way that we might talk of perhaps those first three heavens and earth as being versions 1.1, 1.2 and 1.3, and this post-millennial age as being like version 2.0. I'm not sure if that model will work for you, but great if it does. So I'm going to move on to our third mystery. Now, mystery number 3, what was Paul's thorn in the flesh? Now, it's often said that we can let Scripture interpret Scripture, and there is wisdom in this. However, there is a danger that we can first decide what the answer that we want is, and then selectively use Scripture to prove it. So some have suggested that the thorn in the flesh was a problem with Paul's eyesight. Others that the thorn in the flesh was the opposition of Judaizers trying to take the ecclesias back to the law of Moses. And, of course, as well as that, others as his thorn in the flesh being others who were promoting false doctrines. Now, I'm going to suggest two alternatives one of them is sort of related to the oppositions, but not exactly that. And we'll see what we mean in a few moments. So, the idea that the thorn in the flesh was opposition to Paul's work in the ecclesias has some support in verses like Numbers 33 verse 55. Numbers 33 verse 55. "But if ye will not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come to pass that those which ye let remain of them shall be pricks in your eyes, and thorns in your sides, and shall vex you in the land wherein you dwell." So in support of this idea, we have the pagan people of the land described as thorns in their sides. There are also contraindications. If Paul is referring back to this verse, why does he say a thorn in the flesh? So we have there a singular thorn. Why say that if it's multiple oppositions? And why say in the flesh rather than saying thorns in his side. You see, we can't claim similarities as conclusive proof whilst ignoring the differences. And in fact, we'll find that this is exactly the principle that evolutionists do when describing things like the use of fossils to prove the evolution of the horse. Looking at a number of fossils, everything that's similar is taken as meaning that they're all a series together. Everything that's different is taken as evolution from one step to the next, even though the dating of the fossils used in the case of the evolution of the horse, the dating doesn't support that. So, it's going to go to the next slide. Now, I think we need another edit there. I just accidentally flicked ahead to the next slide, and I'll flick back again. So you might want to do another edit there. So let's look further at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We look at verse 8. Verse 8 says that it might depart from me. So we've got a singular it, one singular thing, not some multiple oppositions, and depart from me, not depart from the ecclesias. Verse 9, for my strength is made perfect in weakness, says God to Paul. And Paul says, most gladly, therefore, I will rather glory in my infirmities. You see, Paul is speaking of his weakness and his infirmities, not of the errors of others. Verse 10, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So here we see a range of things that he's suffered, and the list includes his infirmities in addition to distresses, persecution and reproaches or insults. Now, the next slide surprised me. It uses a method that is used for problem solving in industry. I've used this method myself, and it is called is not. And we're going to have a look at the little table on the next slide. So the slide shows some problems with the 2 common ideas about Paul's thorn in the flesh. And we need to look for an answer that ticks all of the boxes. In the principle of the is not is that if something doesn't give you a tick in a box, then you've got a real problem that it doesn't fit. It's a bit like, imagine a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, and 3 sides fit and one side of the piece doesn't. You know it's not in the right place. So if some of the things fit and one or more doesn't, you've got a real problem. So an eyesight problem doesn't fit in really with the buffeting. That word buffeting, the Greek, implies something that hits, and in fact it seems to imply something being hit, like being hit by a fist, but in surprise. Something suddenly hitting you out of the blue, so to speak. And likewise, my infirmities, which is repeated, doesn't imply false teachers in the ecclesias. It's Paul's infirmities that we're looking at. So we can see that the eyesight and the oppositions have some little crosses in there to say these just don't fit in the jigsaw puzzle. So we might ask now, where else do we find Paul suffering, being pricked in his flesh by a thorn or by something? And the answer is at his conversion. And in that case, I think that all of us will agree that Saul of Tarsus kicking against the pricks was the internal conflict created by the evidence of Stephen's speech to a man who was a Pharisee of the Pharisees and knew his Old Testament scriptures. And this created a massive conflict between heart and mind. To accept what Stephen had conclusively proven from the Old Testament scriptures would turn Saul's best friends into his enemies. It would undermine everything he had lived for. And it would also mean that he had just participated in the murder of innocent men, including Stephen. Well, psychologists call such a state cognitive dissonance. And this is being this conflict between the heart, the feelings, the flesh, if you like, and the mind, the logic, the mind of Christ that we should have if we think of it in that way. So I've got this flesh versus the logic of reasoning. And such a conflict would tend to lead to an emotional response, such as anger, rather than engaging in weighing up the evidence. So, also, I just mentioned that the Greek, when we look at that kicking against the pricks, has the idea of something unspecified as to what exactly it is. Is it a thorn? Is it a cattle goad or whatever? So, could the thorn in the flesh that Paul refers to in 2 Corinthians 12 be something internal in the mind of Paul? So let's consider alternative ideas that we've not previously considered. In verse 10 of 2 Corinthians 12, we find that Paul speaks of persecutions and distresses. Now, if we go back to chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, we find this is expanded on. So let's just go back for a moment to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verses 24 and 25. Verse 24. Of the Jews, 5 times received I 40 stripes save one. Thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. Paul suffered traumatic events. And we have here 3 examples. We have the beating and the whipping, where he would be held down and beaten or whipped. We have the being stoned, where he would probably be thrown into a pit or somewhere where they could easily throw the stones at him to put him to death. And the third being the shipwreck. And we can imagine that situation of being shipwrecked. It was for a night and a day. It would involve hanging onto a piece of driftwood for a whole night and day. And it would not be unreasonable for Paul to suffer from what we would call today post-traumatic stress disorder. And this disorder results in reliving these traumatic experiences in flashbacks, as if the person is reliving those events, and that can happen and be triggered to happen at the most inopportune moments. Such flashbacks can even mean the memory of things like the taste, the smell, the sounds. All of these things are relived. The person is suddenly immersed into the flashback to that terrible event. We can imagine how debilitating that would be and how it would impact the Apostle Paul if he was perhaps trying to give a talk or something. So when we go to 2 Corinthians 12 verse 7, we have the idea of a messenger of Satan buffeting him. Again, it's singular, a messenger of Satan buffeting him, so not talking of multiple oppositions, so we might try and think, what could a messenger of Satan be? Well, let's go back to Luke 22 verse 3 for a moment, and I'll read this if you don't want to actually look it up yourselves. It's Luke 22 verse 3, and it says, Then entered Satan into Judas, surnamed Iscariot, being the number of the 12. So we see here Judas enticed by the thought of money and lusting after it in his particular case, so it's some external stimulus. And thus here we can see Satan referring to our internal adversary working in conjunction with those external stimuli. So the nature of the flesh that we see here. And in the case of Judas, it's something that he is lusting after. In Paul's case, we could see the stimulus as being painful past experiences that are like those stimuli coming back into the present as if being relived. So if Paul did suffer from traumatic flashbacks like that, after what he'd experienced, then perhaps a stimulus such as just a pat on the back or somebody taking him by the arm would potentially recall being grabbed to be beaten. An angry gesture from a member of the audience would perhaps make him flash back to the person's arm swinging, bearing a stone thrown at him. And perhaps in the night he would wake up, tasting the salt water in his mouth and feeling the intense thirst, gripping onto the blankets as if gripping to a piece of driftwood. And such flashbacks don't happen predictably. They would hit hard at unexpected moments, hence the idea of buffeting. Well, if we turn to Romans chapter 7 and verse 23, we could find ourselves thinking of yet another alternative solution, which I'm just going to deal with very briefly. Romans chapter 7 and other parts of Romans, we see there the idea of Paul having a struggle. Verse 23 here, "But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members." So Paul is talking there of having this battle between the mind, trying to have the mind of Christ, and there's the law of sin, that the flesh nature. And we've got this battle of the two together. And Paul, remember, Paul says, "Oh, wretched man that I am," that he recognises just how much this internal battle is pulling him apart. So could it be the case that Paul, who we know at times to have been a very angry man in his past, could find perhaps that there were times when, rather than loving those who were his enemies, that he would have an overwhelming feeling of rage against them, that the flesh would overcome the mind of Christ that was working in him, that there would be those moments of reversion to the angry nature of Saul of Tarsus, which he would then regret very much. So we see that war that it could have been of the heart of flesh against the Christ-like mind. And we can see how this anger came out in Acts 9 verse 1, Saul breathing out threatening and slaughter. 9 verse 5, if we consider, is kicking against the pricks like a wild bull kicking against a cattle goad. And we have a later event, Acts 15:39, that sharp contention between Paul and Barnabas. So we can add two additional alternatives to the table. And those do seem to fit all of these checks that we're making here. So perhaps we can consider them. No definite claims here, but here are two possible other alternatives as to what the thorn in the flesh might have been. So we're going to conclude now. And we've looked at that question, was Paul a member of the Sanhedrin? It remains a mystery, but perhaps that evidence that we thought we had in the book of Acts for his membership of the Sanhedrin and therefore being married, we can perhaps question that as evidence. We had the question of what is the third heaven, and a simple reading of 2 Peter 3, letting it explain itself, would seem to support the idea that the first heaven and earth was before the flood, the second after the flood and right up to our present time, and the third the millennial age. We then have the question of Paul's thorn in the flesh and have a couple of alternative thoughts to think about there. But before we finish, I've attended and enjoyed talks by prominent speaking brethren at Bible schools and on Zoom. But I'm going to suggest something here, that we as an audience can be guilty of putting our speakers into a position where they feel both compelled to find something new to say and then to speak of those uncertain new ideas that they may develop as if they were certain beyond doubt. And we might ask, have we become, and are we behaving like the people of Israel who became bored with the same old manner of the Word of God? Are we those who are seeking after something new and lusting after it, when we perhaps should be thinking back to the first principles of the truth and making sure that we have those robust? And looking at prophecy, the Jews and even the 12 disciples were absolutely certain beyond doubt that they understood the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah and what he would do. And the 12 disciples and the Jews, the scribes, the Pharisees, the priests, they were wrong. And therefore I suggest we're not wise if we think that we can map out events around the return of Jesus in fine detail, as some perhaps have tended to do, but rather that we know the overall outline and we need to watch for things as they come about. So it is better to be uncertain than to be certain and wrong. Moreover, I suggest that we need to focus on being fully certain of the first principles of the truth and knowing the scriptures so well that we can prove to others those first principles, and that so that we may serve God in truth with our whole heart.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop us a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. Make sure you subscribe and turn on new notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. And remember to come back soon.